Good evening and welcome. Welcome to all our listeners from everywhere that has joined us tonight. And we have an opportunity, a great opportunity in this very special edition of Illuminate to look at a matter which I believe is enraging our communities across the cities, the towns, the families of our country, a matter that needs to be addressed. We will be looking into the outrageous treatment of Child Q that took place in 2020. But before I do so, I want to introduce to you my co-host this evening, um, Reverend Minister Joyce Fletcher. Reverend Joyce, over to you.
Thank you, Bishop Tedroy. I am delighted to be here. I felt like I need to be here, and I think many people across our country feel like their voices must be heard on this very topic of child Q.
Yes.
When it first came out a couple of weeks ago and I read it, involuntary tears just came because I could relate as a mother, not by any title, but just as a mother, to think that that could happen to someone's child. And so I I am pleased that as a church we've opened this platform to have this dialogue, have discussions, to hear the voice of our people and to look at outcomes, what outcomes we would like. And that's what we want to discuss tonight. Isn't that right, Bishop? What outcomes we
Absolutely.
want to
Mm.
see um, in relation, not just for Child Q, because I know there are many injustices and many challenges that parents, young people are facing in our communities. And I know that we're not the only one that's speaking out. There are others, and we want to collaborate. We want to work in partnership for the greater good. So I'm delighted to be here, co-hosting tonight. It's a must.
Indeed. And I think it's important for us as a church community, and some word church is used so often, it's lots this meaning. The people that God has and is working upon and working through, called to be salt and light. We really do, Joyce, have a major role to play in dialogue, in conversations, not just to ourselves, but to engage the practitioners, the organizations, the institutions across our country in a joined up dialogue. I call it the strategy of voice and action. And tonight, as we come, I really first, I think it's important for us to express our regret and to extend our prayers, following the horrific discovery that the Metropolitan Police strip searched an underage minor while she was menstruating. Let's be very clear about what's transpired.
Yeah.
Churches together in England's Pentecostal and Charismatic Forum and Racial Justice Working Group released the following statement. Let's begin there. Churches together in England, Racial Justice Working Group and Pentecostal and Charismatic Forum wish to share our dismay and horror at the report of a 15-year-old girl who was strip searched while on menstruation at school. Yes, at school. As
Yes.
churches, we believe that civic institutions, such as schools and the police, should be safe spaces for our young people to flourish and have dignity. Joyce, this really enrages me, as I know it does you. Could you pick up on the second part of this statement for us?
Yes, Bishop. We are concerned about the breaches in safeguarding and call on the Metropolitan Police, the Secretary of State for the Home Office, the Right Honourable Preeti Patel, MP, the Minister of State for Crimes and Policing, the Right Honourable Maltos MP and Secretary of State for Education, and
Right.
our government to to review safeguarding practice, the report and statement of the Independent Child Safeguarding Commissioner. We need answers. We need answers.
Yeah.
And yes, we've seen that report, we've read that report, and we've come together as a church, we've come together as a collective force to actually call to question. We need answers. We need answers. You have to excuse me, Bishop, because it's an emotive subject. Um,
Yes.
and I know that people who are watching tonight are feeling that emotion, and they felt it. People have gone out on the streets, they've marched, they've had a range of emotions. And tonight we want to equip our communities with
Mm.
how they can make their voices heard.
Indeed. Indeed. Yes. And we also want to express our deep empathy to Child Q and her
Yes,
family and extended families and community for the distress that this has caused. And as churches, we continue to work and pray for a safe, fair, equitable society for young people and all of our people to flourish. As a matter of fact, it was only maybe 35, 40 minutes ago, Reverend Joyce and I were taking part in a conversation in regards to some of the leaders within the West Midlands and how we can address this and other similar matters. And so going forward this evening, I would love to invite Reverend Joyce just to introduce our panelists. Firstly, let me mention we have Dr. Lurleen Gregory. Dr. Lurleen?
Dr.
Thank you, Lola. I'm Reverend Dr. Miller, and I am an educator. I'm a pastor of churches, and I'm also a humanitarian. I'm vice chair, which is together in England, the statement, but I'm also joint chair of Racial Justice Working Group. My contribution to this is a whole area of racial justice and equity. Not so much equality. We all know we're equal, but so I'm here to really to this conversation. Distraught people do at this point in time. There have been a number of discussions around families concerning this matter of grave concern, and thus we're to pull our voices together this evening to send a very first thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lurleen. We greatly appreciate you being here this evening. We also have Dr. Sharon Byfield. Sharon?
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Bishop and Minister Joyce. Yes, I'm Dr. Sharon Byfield. I'm delighted to be here this evening, but not necessarily delighted about the subject that we are having to be discussing. That is just such a painful topic at this time. But just by way of brief introduction, I've come at the table today, joined the panel from an educational perspective, mainly from governance. I've been involved in education for a number of years. I've got a real passion for children, which I have had for most of my life. Working in the church capacity, starting off as a Sunday school teacher, director for Christian education, Sunday school superintendent. On a trustee level, I serve as a trustee for my local church. I'm also the safeguarding lead on that board. So I chair the safeguarding committee for church. I'm also a co-founder of Excel3, which is a national educational charity that started well over 20 years ago via the Church of God of Prophecy, some 22 years ago. And from that, we run the Black Boys Can project, which is a educational program designed to raise the academic attainment and achievement and aspirations of Black boys. We also run the Apex University program, which that is opened up to a wider group of less advantaged students. And the aim is to get them into universities, particularly accessing the more elitist universities, in which our Black students typically find it difficult to break into. Shortly, we are about to launch the National Leadership Association for Young Black Men and Women, which is about aiming to get our young professionals into leadership positions in various sectors. And lastly, I'm also the founder of King Solomon International Business School. That's an all-through school in central Birmingham. It's a Christian school with a primary, secondary, sixth form and early years provision. And that is based in the heart of Birmingham. Our specialism is international business and enterprise. And we use the fruit of the Spirit as our character development framework. So we seek to develop the characters of our children in addition to educating them to the best that we possibly can. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sharon. Reverend Joyce, over to you to introduce the rest of our panel.
Thank you. We want to go over to our Detective Inspector Joel Edwards Jr. Joel? Okay. Whilst I will move on swiftly then to Professor Dawn Edge. If you could introduce yourself.
Good evening, everyone. So it's my pleasure to be here as has been already said, not a great subject to be talking about, but it's great to be on the platform and great that we're here, bring together our collective voices to express our outrage, but also to think about what can be done. So I'm Professor of Mental Health and Inclusivity at the University of Manchester. I'm also Director of a research unit within our local mental health trust, Greater Manchester Mental Health, which is dedicated to researching matters of equality, diversity and inclusion in mental health generally and the intersection between mental and physical health. In terms of my church, I'm a member of a New Testament Church of God, where I am a former Women's Ministries President and currently a member of the Church and Pastors Council. And the reason I think it's really important for us to be having this conversation is because we're acknowledging, I think, that what's happened to Child Q hasn't happened in a vacuum, but it's come from somewhere. That this is the product, what's happened to this young woman, and indeed many other of our children, has a long history and it's come from somewhere. This is a manifestation of something, and I think that's probably what we're going to be talking about as we go on. But I just really wanted to highlight one of the things that, apart from the shocking details that Bishop has already outlined, but the other thing is that this young woman was taken out of an exam. She was in the middle of an exam. She was removed. This traumatic thing happened to her, and then she was put back into the exam. And so we know that there is a really toxic relationship between many of our children and the education system, as well as with the police. So I know that during the pandemic, when there was all the kerfuffle about student grades and how they were going to be assessed under the lockdown conditions, I know so many Black children and their parents who are absolutely beside themselves because we rely on the exam to get some measure of fairness, because if we know that if we rely on teacher assessed grades, our children are consistently marked down in comparison to their actual ability. And so we touched in the very beginning about safeguarding, and I think it's really important that we go back to this, because I know quite rightly there's been a lot of focus on the police because they're the ones who perpetuated or perpetrated this act. But actually they were enabled to do that. So the school called the police, and teachers stood outside the room while this happened. And we send our children to schools, places of safety. Schools are in effect in loco parentis. We hand over parental responsibility for our children to schools. And it's inconceivable to me that any of those teachers who allowed this to happen would have allowed this to happen to their children and would have thought it was a good thing. So maybe later on we can talk a little bit more about the trauma that this young woman faced, and indeed so many of our children, and the potential impact on mental health, and why the work that I'm doing at the other end, this is where it has its roots. It has its roots in childhood and the racism and discrimination that our children experience, and it becomes almost normalized because it happens so often, and that is just wrong. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dawn. Thank you. We'll move on swiftly to our Commander, Alison Haydar. I think I've pronounced that correctly. I understand she's the most senior Black police woman within the Metropolitan Police. Please come forward and introduce yourself.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Good. Okay. So I'm Dr. Alison Haydar. I'm in the Met Police, and as you said, I'm the most senior Black female police officer within the UK, actually. I've got 21 years service in policing, and I've got responsibility for about a quarter of London, looking from central London out to the northwest. I'm responsible for all of the frontline policing issues, including performance and various disciplinary issues and so on and so forth for quarter of London. But I'm also the Met lead for neighbourhoods, so I'm responsible for the implementation of neighbourhood teams across the Met, and I'm the chief officer, NPCC officer, so the chief officer responsible for out-of-court disposals. So, and that is, for those who are not familiar with the term, out-of-court disposals are any opportunities to deal with low-level offences, especially with young people, instead of putting them through the criminal justice system, looking at how we can implement diversionary activities in order to stop them coming into a system which is so difficult to come out of once you enter. My policing background is in both serious crime and in uniform, and I've spent a lot of years looking at engagement activities with communities. That's my passion, and I've been able to bring some new ways of engaging with communities, especially young Black men, within the Met. I've had 19 years experience of policing in Hampshire Constabulary, and then came over to the Met on promotion nearly 2 years ago. I'm sure I will contribute a bit later to the issue around child queue, but what I will start off by saying is that I'm as outraged as anybody else on this call about what's happened. I've come out publicly, as you may or may not have seen me, on the news and in various forums talking about this issue that should really never have happened. And I think there are some bigger issues around the discussion and the agenda around treating children as adults, and all sorts of issues that I've heard so far on the line. So that's my background. I have a particular interest, actually, in my research was underpinned by the theory of procedural justice, and I have got a particular issue and interest in procedural justice and how we weave that into the things that we do when we are engaging with communities, and that includes with young people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commander, for outlining your experiences, and we're delighted to have you join us this evening. I will now move across to Detective Inspector Joel Edwards Jr. Please introduce yourself.
Good evening, all. Hi, my name is Joel. I am, as you've heard, I'm a detective inspector in the Metropolitan Police. I have around now just over 20 years policing in London, originally from London, now living out in not London, but still very aware of a lot of the issues that are going on. My current role finds me in the realm of professionalism, and my chief responsibility at the minute is working with the Deputy Commissioner's Delivery Group, which is a group that's been put together in response to matters like George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, and those kind of areas, and looking at how we as a police service can better publicise and identify good practice for building trust and confidence with primarily with the Black community. I'm also a father, so as I'm sure everyone on this call, I do resonate with what's happened and what we're talking about tonight with child Q. And on top of that as well, I was brought up in the church and in around faith, and still very, very active where I can be around those areas. So tonight I'm really looking forward to building some not trust and confidence, because that's really jargony speak, but to allow ourselves to be as vulnerable as we need to be to build the appropriate relationships, and to be as open and have a really open discussion around what is happening as far as we can speak, what is happening and how we can help, and how we can really tap into our own vulnerabilities internally and what lessons that we can learn, but also how we can build real, lasting and sustainable relationships with key members of communities such as ourselves as Black majority church. So really, really appreciated and excited about this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you, Joel, for sharing that and just, your just openness. Thank you for sharing that. We do have some, we're glad that we've got the Metropolitan Police represented here today. We do have some tough questions, because that's why we're here today, to ask those tough questions. And we're going to kick off with the questions, and I'll kick off with the first question. People are asking why, in sheer disbelief, mothers out there, parents, the wider community is shocked and outraged by this horrific incident. And parents and children are afraid. I just need to quote something. So, for those who are watching, who are tuning in today, the report is out there. If you just Google Child Q, you will see that report. And in that report is a quote from Child Q. And I need to read that just so you get an essence of what she said when she was interviewed. So she said, someone walked into the school where I was supposed to feel safe, took me away from the people who were supposed to protect me and strip me naked while I was on my period. On the top of preparing for the most important exams of my life, I can't go a single day without wanting to scream, to shout, to cry, or just give up. I feel like I'm locked in a box and no one can see or cares that I just want to go back to feeling safe again. My box is collapsing around me and no one wants to help. I don't know if I'm going to feel normal again. I just don't know how long it will take to repair my box. But I know this can't happen to anyone ever again. All the people that allowed this happen needs to be held to account. I'll stop there. So the question I want to ask, first of all, to Dr. Lurleen, followed by Professor Dawn Edge, and then Dr. Sharon, and then we're going to come to our Metropolitan Police representatives, is parents and children are afraid. Do they have the right to continue to be afraid? Do they have the right?
And Rev Joyce,
Yes.
just before Dr. Lurleen responds, can we frame that within what the infrastructure, the regulations, if you like, that governs our schools, modern safeguarding policies are child-centric. That's overarching. That's the whole ethos of that. Teachers are fully aware of Section 13 of working together to safeguard children. So all that you have shared hangs under this. All members of staff have a duty to voice their concerns. So as we go to our panelists, I just thought we'd put that overarching infrastructural item in there.
Thank you, Bishop. Thank you. I think that's really important. Dr. Lurleen, over to you.
You used the word horrific to describe this incident, and indeed it feels almost as if there's no word to describe it. We're talking about a mind, we're talking about a child, and the word child actually means vulnerable, that child is vulnerable and is not in a position to actually take care of themselves and so on. And here they are in institution where all this incident happened, and the horrifics of it that then has come about later. The second, Nadim Zahawi, actually recently he made the don't need to be a parent to be horrified by this incident and be a fugation and something done about this. But the pose, should parents be afraid? My response to this is yes, should be. We sometimes are the main words we think about concerns and so on, and I think it has been a situation across the black for too long of my life. Whatever capacity I've worked in and so on, we've come across challenges. Later after slavery, when a situation we are not comfortable and we need to be afraid in society today, which is supposed to be society. I think the black community have become to being afraid. Or I think you just have to speak to Black and I mean, time in my capacity as a pastor, in my capacity as a teacher, in my capacity as a participant in various community type situations. People for Black parents, when their child leave the home, example, to go down the road to see a friend, to pop out somewhere, to go whatever, there's a fear that still that they don't feel at home, they don't feel comfortable or at peace until that child comes to the door. And that has moved itself way into our school environments. And although we're discussing point in time, there are so many cues out there. There's so many scenarios that have not to the public domain, but it is happening. And parents have cause to be concerned. Be able to happen 21st century, in a civilized society, more than outrage. And if we are not concerned as a community, it might be our child next, for already saying it has already been my child. And so I believe that there is need to be afraid and concerned. When I say fear, I'm not talking about the kind of panic fear. I'm talking about a concerned fear, to the point that we should all be really pulling our voices together and our efforts together to ensure that this kind of incident stops, and it stops now.
Thank you, Dr. Lurleen. I know we've had a few technical issues, but we could make out what you were saying, that there is a sense of fear. It's a concerned fear, not a panic fear. Parents do need to have that concern about their children. Thank you for that. We're going to move across now to Professor Dawn. Do parents, children, do they need to be afraid? What's your take on it?
So it's a strange question, isn't it, that people need to be afraid, because that says something. The fact that certain groups of society need to be afraid. And as I said earlier on, that's because there's a historical legacy where the relationships between the police and Black people in this country has been toxic for a long time. And not just the police, as I've said, it's a systemic issue. So we're talking actually about institutional structural racism, aren't we? That flows through the whole of society and governs the way some groups of people are viewed. And it's clear that whoever did this to this young woman didn't see her as being like their child or like their sister, and actually didn't probably see her as being quite human, because you wouldn't do that to another human being, would you? And lots of people describe this incident as being traumatic, and it is traumatic. And just so that we get it in context, trauma can happen in a series of contexts, but it's usually when people feel frightened, the kind of things that generate fear. You feel that you're under threat, humiliated, rejected, abandoned, invalidated, unsafe, unsupported, trapped, ashamed, powerless. These are the kind of feelings that, as Sister Joyce read out, this young woman is talked about, that she's experiencing. But also it's really important to understand that there is a strong correlation between that kind of trauma, race-based traumatic stress injury, some people call it, and our long-term impacts on our mental health. Yeah. So this young woman's talked about feeling very anxious and on edge and unable to relax. Sometimes she feels like screaming. It would be very surprising if she doesn't have intrusive thoughts or flashbacks. Some people might call that PTSD. That her behavior might become avoidant. She can't stand being around people. She might be really frightened of being out in public in case people recognize her and know this has happened to her, even if they wouldn't. There's that fear. This then obviously impacts your self-confidence, your self-esteem, can generate all kinds of physical symptoms, including problems with your heart. And actually a lot of this can be internalized and lead to self-blame. And we know that there is a thing called racial trauma, and that it has many layers. So there's the historical trauma. So many of our children and young people grow up And very early on, they know, they hear the stories, they hear about what's happened to their families, and then they look through history and they see the historical trauma that's been perpetuated against people that like themselves, that look like them. And then there's a vicarious trauma. And I think we need to remember that this, although this act was perpetrated against a single young person, it was an entire school community and lots of other young people who look like her, who realize that it could have been me. It could just as easily have been me. And that then generates fear in them. And for lots of parents who themselves have been traumatized over the years, there's that intergenerational trauma. So when things like this happen, it's triggering for them. So what we have is this vortex of trauma and fear and anxiety, which is so dangerous and so damaging. And it's really interesting to hear the detective inspector talking about all that the police have been doing to build trust and confidence in the communities, and it's going to be really interesting to hear what's going to be done to even begin to address this, because all that this has done for many Black people is just to underscore what we've always believed, which is that we're not treated fairly, and that the very people whose job it is to protect us do the opposite.
Thank you for that. And I think the point I'd want to bring out from what you said is that kind of vicarious fear and what the message is that sends to the wider community. Thank you for sharing. I'm going to move across to Dr. Sharon, and then I'm going to come to Joel and our commander. Thank you.
Right, there's been many times when I've been addressing parents in schools, and I often refer to their children as lambs. Yeah, your little lambs. And that's just an endearing way in which I speak. Now, when I think of child Q, yes, she was a little lamb. She was the lamb of her parents. But in this instance, what we also see is a lamb that was actually led, a child that was actually led as a lamb to the slaughter. And therefore that brings a lot of anguish and deep concern. For me, as a governor, as an educational provider, I think the fact that this actually happened on school premises is deeply concerning. There's a sense of responsibility. It makes me question the extent to which not just this girl's school, but the extent to which all schools are really equipped and are committed to ensure that the children are safe. Because at the end of the day, schools are the next place in which children spend most of their time, bar the home, it is school. They spend an awful lot of their time in school. And so if they come to school and are not safe, that's a significant issue. That's a significant issue, because schools are supposed to be safe places. I remember when we were actually designing the school for King Solomon International Business School, safeguarding was top of our priority. Mm-hmm. We had to get the design of the building right. The entrance had to be right. So that when the school was open, the children, once they come into your school, they're going to be safe. So to get through the gates and then discover that our children are still not safe because of what goes on in the school is of major concern. For child Q, for this little lamb, there was a fundamental breach of trust and confidence. The child, I noted, didn't put up any resistance to what was going on. She had the confidence that she was at school hand, her teachers, who she has confidence in, said that she needs to go into a room with the police, who, again, she should have confidence in. And on both grounds, her trust and confidence was breached, both from the school and from the police. So should she be afraid? Should our children be afraid? Should our parents and our community be afraid? Yes, but in the sense of, this is a fundamental breach of trust and confidence, a fundamental breach of trust and confidence. And I have to commend Child Q, this little lamb, for speaking out. A lot of children and women who suffer abuse suffer it in silence. I noted in the reports when they kind of implied that the child didn't want her parents to be there. Well, I question that, because this child went home and she told her mother there was a relationship there. So I'm concerned about how many other children could this have happened to. It's just that we don't know about it. Just like the George Floyd incidents, the fact that we actually saw him killed before our very eyes, but so many black men have been killed, have been brutally murdered. But now it's come to the forefront. I just wonder how many other of our black girls have actually suffered in this or similar ways. So I have to commend Child Q for speaking out. I've got to commend her mother for taking immediate action. And my heart goes out as to how she must have been feeling over these since 2020. Things have just come out now. I'm mindful about how she is receiving and accepting that, but I'm hoping that she will gain courage in knowing that we as a community, as a church community, as a black community, as other members of other communities who are looking on this issue and saying, no, this isn't right. So, my prayer is that she's taking comfort, and that this will be part of her healing as she goes through a young adult life. If I can just end with this quote. This was actually talking about America, but I think this is very relevant. It says, where justice is denied, where racism is enforced, where ignorance prevails, and where there is only one race is made to feel that society is an organized conspiracy to oppress, rob, and degrade them, then neither person nor property is safe. So our community has a right not to feel safe, because their dignity has been denied, justice has been denied, ignorance, willful ignorance sometimes prevails, and our race, there is a feeling that within society there's organized conspiracy to oppress, rob, and degrade us, and therefore no, we do not feel safe.
Thank you, Dr. Sharon, for such a comprehensive and thought-provoking response. And just before I go to our Met colleague here, I just need to today we got some feedback from some young people, and I think it's important that I just share this before you respond. And this is a quotation, and this is from a random young person that we sent this we just asked for general feedback, and someone said, all I can say is that the Metropolitan Police have been cancelled for years. That's the word a young person used. So for me, once they're mentioned, it's a red flag. They went way too far. It's sickening that women actually did this. and they exposed this girl and made her take off her sanitary towel. Now the girl doesn't talk and is cutting herself. And they wonder why young people have no respect for the police force. If she was related to me, I would have sued the cops individually, sued the Metropolitan Police and the school. This is incredibly shocking. Like, what on earth is happening in school? No one is safe nowadays. That's come from a young person. So I just want to ask you the question. I don't know who's going to go first. Noel, do you want to go first, and then over to Commando? Do people have a right not to feel safe? They're clearly saying that they don't feel safe.
Mum?
I can go first if you like.
Yeah,
So I can completely understand why people wouldn't feel safe. What has happened, I cannot argue with any of, I'm sorry, I can't remember your name, the lady who spoke before in the stripy top, but there's no way that anyone can say that what happened was right. Absolutely not. And I understand the trauma that this has caused, not just to Child Q, but her family, and also the community. I'm from a Black community as well. I was born and brought up in London, and I lived in London till my early 20s, so I understand the feeling around not feeling safe. And I can understand why people wouldn't feel safe given what's happened. There is disparity within not just policing, but the criminal justice system. And, you know, we are all very well rehearsed in understanding the issues that affect Black people within society. And I have a particular concern about young Black men, which is why I've centred a lot of my initiatives, engagement initiatives with young Black men to try to build trust and confidence with that particular part of society, because I understand the historic backdrop to the relationships with people and the police. However, what I will say is that although this has happened, there is work that is ongoing to try to improve where we actually are at the moment. I know that there are a lot of fractured relationships with members of the Black community. However, that isn't universal. I've got to say, in that there are some really good pockets of work that are going on, and I give Croydon as an example of some really close relationships that we are having with some members of the Black community, but that's not universal. And where we stand now is not good enough. So I can't and I won't defend where we are now. As part of my my portfolio, I'm responsible for schools officers across the Met as part of the neighbourhood cohort. And I must say that I see some incredible work that some of our schools officers do to build trust and confidence in all sorts of communities, including Black communities among young Black people. So although I do understand why there will be many people who don't feel safe because what has happened is inexcusable, can't defend that at all. But what I will say from my own interactions with people is that that feeling is not universal. We do have some members of the Black community who I personally work with who have great trust and confidence in us. And one thing I will say as well is that for those who don't have confidence in us, I would want to encourage those people to join groups, to give us feedback. If they've not been treated well, they absolutely must complain to the police. They must be able to come to us and complain, and for the IOPC to make their inquiries, to understand where we have gone wrong and make recommendations so that we continue to understand that feedback from Black communities. And we have all sorts of scrutiny panels, independent advisory groups. We've got some fantastic Black people who help us to really understand the impact of our policies and procedures on them. And I think it would be a great shame if Black people withdrew from those scrutiny arrangements and those governance arrangements, because we need you. We need you to keep telling us where we are getting it wrong so that we can review our policies and try to get it right more often. So my answer in short is that yes, I do understand why people will not feel safe. However, please help us to up our game. We need you.
Thank you, Commander Alison. Over to Detective Inspector Joel Edwards.
Yeah, Joel is fine. Good evening. I think there are a number of iterations of this question, and I think the first question you asked, Minister, was, should we feel afraid as parents, as a community? And the answer is undoubtedly no. And that follows on what the Commander was saying. Actually, we are not in a position. Yes, we don the cloth of the police, and yes, we kind of walk a line as Black people from the Black community, and also police in a policing community, and we work very hard to bridge those things together. So do we have a right to be afraid? Yes, absolutely. And as the Commander said, you can't defend the indefensible. You know, I grew up hearing that you don't put your hand in fire for nobody. So, you know, I don't think that's what myself or Commander Haydar are here to do. We're certainly not here to try and defend or make excuses, particularly as, you know, there are still investigations ongoing and those kind of things. So should we be afraid? No, we shouldn't be. We shouldn't have to be afraid. But do we have a right to be afraid? Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Positively. And there is, you know, it's there, it's in black and white, you know, regardless of where you sit, regardless of where your boundaries are or your lines are. And there are a lot of conflicting thoughts around any incident that comes out. You know, I hear both from in the police and out of the police, people who question, well, was it this and was it that? Because there's not a lot of information known and those kind of things. And we can run the gauntlet of allowing our minds to fill in the gaps that we don't yet know. All of that being said, the Commander is absolutely right. We are working tirelessly and we're not there yet. And there are so many reasons why we're not there yet. It's a slow and arduous process, which has been the Black struggle, is a slow and arduous process. But we are making strides. We are moving forward, and it's slow and it's frustrating and it's grueling work at times, because we take some really amazing steps forward and we make some really amazing relationships and bonds with the community, and then stuff like this happens and we have to go back to the beginning. And it's I can't tell you, I can't viscerally get across the frustration that we will feel as police officers, both Black and white police officers, within the organisation and across the country about that. But again, I echo, come on board with us, walk with us, journey with us. My plea is, it's so easy for us after years of distrust and mistrust, justifiably so. It's so easy after years of having to be afraid, having to second guess, having to teach our children, oh, you need to be more and above and beyond, and you need to behave differently to get the same level of treatment. It's so easy to become punch drunk and freedom fatigued in that pursuit and quest. But our urge and our plea is, come on with us. Let us hear your frustrations. Let us hear your ideas. Tell us where the opportunities to come on board and do stuff are. Invite us into your churches. Invite us into your schools. If you're struggling where you are, let me know. We can get you the links. We can signpost you to where we need to be, so that hopefully this time in 6 months, 2 months, next week, we are a little bit less afraid than we are today.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Dr. Alison. Over to Bishop. I'm sure you've got some comments to make on that and move on to the next question.
Indeed. Thank you, panelists, for sharing in the way that you have. Yes, there are some questions from our viewers that have come in up front, but the overarching strategy for me, when we look at this discussion tonight, what takes place after this discussion, voice and action. Well, thought, voice and action, the overarching strategy. So tonight, our voices are being heard. Tomorrow, action needs to follow. I hear the points that's been made about dialogue, but someone says there must be a happy medium somewhere between being totally informed and blissfully unaware. Totally informed and blissfully unaware. My thought is, if child Q was aware of her rights as a person, and she knew where the police had crossed the line, that would be the first challenge. I hear what Sharon said in terms of complimenting our child Q, her behavior, and that is adorable. But surely, if we inform our young people, all our people, this is where it starts and that's where it finishes. Now, in regards to the failure of the infrastructure of the teachers that permitted that to happen, a straight question. Surely, teachers should never have allowed that to have happened. Is that a yes or a no? The teacher should never. But I see, though, coming out of this, there ought to be something that goes to inform our young people that says, these are the 5 points to consider if you're stopped, if you're being searched. Somebody said in the meeting earlier, whether it's a little video clip or a little card that you carry, these are the parameters. I'd love to get a response from Commander Alison on that.
I completely agree. I think, and when I first arrived in the Met nearly 2 years ago, I very quickly made lots of links, and one of them was with a barrister who's doing some work around just what you said, issuing things on YouTube and little cards and informing people of their rights. Absolutely, young people must and should know what their rights are. I would like to open an invitation. I'd like to open an invitation to continue with this conversation going forward, because this evening we have a very limited time to discuss the action bit. And you make a really good point. Joel knows me. People know me in the Met. I'm not a person who just sits and talks about stuff. I kind of get on with it, because it's everyone can talk about stuff. We can have strategies, we can have plans. All of that stuff is all very nice. But if nothing comes at the other end of it to make a change, then to be quite frank, we're wasting our time. So I would like to open an invitation to continue this discussion, hopefully face to face, and I'd love you to come to New Scotland Yard for us to actually talk about what is going to change. How can you, as a collective, help us to change? What recommendations would you make? I've got a system of, I'm calling it an innovation hub, where I get people together and I have a framework where at the end of the session, we've got some recommendations and pilots and things that we want to try, something new to make a difference. And I'd like to take this opportunity to invite you to come to visit me in New Scotland Yard. I'll even put on lunch for you, for us to talk in more detail about this issue and how we can help our young people. Because I absolutely agree, we do need to ensure that our young people understand what their rights are. And if they don't feel that they've received their rights, then they must know how they can complain and get justice. Because for me, this is all about procedural justice. You make a really good point.
And just before you go, Commander, once again, we thank you for taking your time out to discuss this very important matter. We, as a collective of churches, have something similar in the West Midlands, where the Police and Crime Commissioner has agreed to meet with us at least 4 times a year, so we can begin to unpack and to get to the granular level of policy and the implementations of policy, and how the churches and parachurch organizations can engage with that. Maybe that's something we really ought to consider, because most of what we do tends to be reactionary. It's happened, the horse has bolted, and we're responding. And really what we're saying here as a part of the thought, voice, and action strategy is just 2 things to put on the table for maybe yourselves and your colleagues to consider. But thank you.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate you joining us. Thank you. We've kind of, our Commander, Alison, now needs to leave, but we're going to continue with the rest of the program. We've got till 9 o'clock, and we've still got some more questions that we want to ask the panel. And there are still some key challenges, hard questions, hard points that we need to raise, because yes, it's good to talk, but we need to move to a point of action. How will we know? What's our measure of success? How will we know when people feel less afraid? And that we're in a context of Black Lives Matter, we're in a context of the wider discrimination and challenges that faces us within society. So we're back. Professor Dawn Edge, I noticed you got your hands up in response to something that the Commander said. Do you need to take it now, or can we move on with some of the questions?
Yeah, I'd like to take it now. It's a shame she's gone, because I just think, listening to all that's been said, and with you, Joel, and I've no doubt that you're absolutely committed and you're doing great work. But I know she's gone now, but the former Met Commissioner, Presiding, she said she was on a mission to have these so-called school safety officers embedded into the DNA of schools. And if you look at where these police officers are deployed, they're not in the leafy suburbs. I don't think you have these officers in Eton and Harrow, do you? They're disproportionately in schools with large ethnic minority populations. And I totally understand, I totally agree that we ought to equip all of our children, black, white, brown, all children should understand about their rights as citizens and as human beings. But what we've had to do as black parents for far too long, and I think what I'm hearing being said again tonight, is that we've got to give them we've got to put extra layers of responsibility on them for them to know how to police themselves and to manage the police and to manage teachers. And it's a ridiculous burden that we're placing on our children, where that responsibility actually should lie with the adults whose duty of care it is to look after them. And the police, who's supposed to make them feel safe, I certainly used to tell my children, if you get lost, if you get into trouble, go to the police. Well, we can't do that anymore. That's what our children are telling us. They don't feel safe. So giving them cards and all of those things are fine. But we know from all the evidence that had that young woman even dared to try to resist, not just physically, but even verbally, the chances are she would have been arrested. So what we're having is the increasing criminalization of our children, and activities that a few years ago would have been, you were sent to the head teacher's office and you'd have a good telling off, or you might get a detention. The police are in school, and now those actions are being criminalized. And I don't think that the answer is giving more responsibility to manage that to our children. I think the responsibility lies with the adults, people like ourselves, but more importantly, the education system, the police, and the wider systems of authority that have been used to oppress our children, and indeed many of us on this platform.
Thank you, Professor Dawn. That's a really, I tend to agree with what you've just said, actually, because we're talking about adultification, and that's, I think Bishop's going to be raising that point, that our children are seen as adults, and you know, the repercussions for some of our children and so on. But I can see, Dr. Lurleen, it looks like you desperately want to come in there.
It was really one of the points I wanted to raise with the commander. I'm so sorry that she's had to leave early, because in actual fact, when that was mentioned, and I really hear your heart, Bishop Tedroy, regarding this, but I am so in agreement with Professor Dawn. You know, it was just sending off crazy signals in my head, because for me, you know, we're talking about children, and the expectation is that, and I know Professor Dawn refers to her as a young woman, and that may be the case, but she's a child. She was a child when this happened. This is a vulnerable child. And I have real grave concerns about the fact that we put more and more pressures, and it's always the case in the Black community. We always have to prepare our children to be responsive in a way that our white counterparts don't have to be. They don't have to do things. They don't have to have the same pressures. And this is a continuous pressure that we're adding, which says, you've got to know how to respond. You've got to do this and so on. And it's a lot for them. We've seen in America, parents having to teach their children as soon as they're approached by the law to put their hands up, you know, in surrender and so on. And I just feel that we need to be responding in a way that's not adding pressure to our children, expecting them to have to make this extra effort. This is a vulnerable child who was supposed to be protected. There are child protection practices and rules and regulations and all kinds of stuff in schools. Sometimes to the point that you think, you know, parents, when it's the other way around, parents can turn up to school to pick up their children and can't have access to them. And but here we have a scenario where, first of all, the police isn't even supposed to have been there. This was a school issue. It didn't involve the police. The other thing is that none of these, the school, the police, nobody contacted the parent. Nobody contacted the parents. I mean, then on top of that, you had a situation where the child is brought to by the parent, brought to the GP. Again, the GP is another avenue through which child protection services should have been contacted. So the teacher, certainly the school, abdicated their responsibility here to protect the child, because Nadim Zahawi actually said that the school, the report from the school is that they didn't know that the child was being strip searched. Well, that's a major breach, because if there's an alarm raised, then it is the case, isn't it, that the child protection personnel should be there and should see this through all the way. That child should never be left on her own with the police. And then there's the question, why is there 5 police officers turning up to sort out an issue with one child? What is it about the police not knowing where their responsibilities lie and about whether they should have been there or not? We would imagine that a police officer who understands what's going on here, even if they do arrive at the school to say, well, this is a school issue, it's a school matter, and what we suggest that you do is follow your procedures to contact the parents or whatever. But why are the police taking a child off to strip search them? What I'm saying is that with all of that, the pressures that we already have of these inequalities, to actually be preparing our children to say, you have to fight for yourself, even in a situation where there should be child protection arrangements in place to protect our children. What we have to do is ensure that those work, rather than asking them to be responsible to protect themselves.
I think those are very good points that have been made by Professor Dawn and Dr. Lurleen. I think those are excellent points, and I agree with you, because yes, the first line of defense has to be the environment. It has to be the teachers. And of course, as I cited earlier, in regards to the safeguarding policies within the school, that's the first line of defense. And I would have expected that to have worked. And clearly, the child can't be involved with that, and in no way should be involved with that. But as a last line of defense, I would like to share with my grandchildren now. My children are all grown up. And I'd like to say to them, be aware, if all else fails, and that's my approach to this, if all else fails, know your rights, know where you stand. Because if I do not inform them in that regard, then I would feel as though I might have failed them. As much as everything else, the systems, the police, and all else. But surely, I think I have a responsibility as a last line of defense. And that's what I'm pushing here. But let me pause. I think, Joel, you had a response.
I did and I didn't. I feel free to speak freely, but I'm also very conscious that when, as a police officer, if I respond to certain queries or things, it immediately sounds defensive. And I think, Dr. Auntie Lurleen, if some of the points you make are absolutely correct and they are absolutely symptomatic and representative of what the majority of us as a community, as Black folk, as adults, as the populace will be thinking, why did this happen? Why did it take 5? Why did it do? And one of the things I don't mind saying at this time is that one of the things that the police are not great at is communicating things in a timely fashion, which would help us to unpick certain matters. I'll give you an example. Why does it take 5 officers? And I'm being very, very detective here. I'm being very analytical about this goes in this box, and this goes in this box, and this goes in this box. I only use this as an example. Why does it take 5? It takes 5 because one is the school's officer who wasn't there that day. They call in another. Generally speaking, in a car, you're going to have 2 officers. When the first car arrives, you've got a male and a female. The male cannot do an extra search, so another car arrives. You now have 4 officers. Only 2 of those can be involved in the search. So therefore, you immediately have 4. The 2 men are not involved in the search. Procedurally, I'm not necessarily talking about child queue. I use this as an example because the investigations are still ongoing. But little bits of information like that immediately help us to say, oh, actually, the numbers, where it immediately sounds right, they've been heavy-handed. Well, not necessarily, actually. That's just a procedural thing. But it's those kind of communications which these discussions are very helpful in. Now, does that make the search okay? No, it doesn't. Does that make what happened in the breaches of process at somewhere the structure and the system failed? Yes, it did. But actually, if we're not careful, we get distracted by other bits which are quite easily explained and quite reasonable, and we get distracted from the bits where actually we can do something and something needs to be done. So, for example, what happened with the child safety at the school? Why did the officers, and again, I don't know, the investigation is still going, that's really important to stress, but why did the officers get this far? Why was no one informed? Why was there no appropriate adult? Those kind of issues are very different to how many officers were there, because that stuff, which is reported in a way that allows us to sometimes make things worse than the terrible thing that they are, and actually distracts us from the things which are actually really important, the systemic things that we can deal with. There's always going to be 4 officers unless you've got 2 female officers in a car. Do you understand what I do? So I make no defense of anybody, but I say all of that to say that these conversations are really important, And when we enter them, we must be with an open mind so that we can separate the wheat from the chaff. Because that will help us to really identify and hold people to account where they need to be held to account, and not get distracted by other things which are designed, let's be honest, in media and in sensationalism. And, you know, these things sell papers as well. They are designed to make us have an emotive response and react in a certain way. Because riots sell papers.
I suppose, Joel, that the stats speak for themselves.
Absolutely.
Of the nearly 6,000 searches that took place with children over the last 3 years, 75% of those searches were to people from ethnic minorities.
Yes.
75%, and 80% of those searches found nothing. And the report was very clear about the discrimination informed the practices of those officers. And the professor said earlier on about the systematic. We're talking about systems. We're talking about what's happening across society. Bishop, I can see you edging to come in, and I'm taking over your thunder here. Please do.
No, that's fine. That's fine, Joyce. No, please proceed. Please proceed. No.
Yeah. So the stats speak for themselves, and you know, I'm conscious that time's virtually gone. We've probably got maybe a tenth of what we planned to do tonight, and I think it's important. We heard today from some young people that said, we want our voices to be heard. And in the context of what we've talked about today, from a safeguarding, being person-centered, the voice of the child, I actually think we do need to come back, and we need to make sure that we have young people and parents represented, and that their voices are heard as well. And so we will make that commitment to come back with a part 2, and we've not even scratched the surface, Bishop Tedroy, of the schedule that we plan to discuss tonight, have we?
No, we haven't. And it's so important, though, Joyce, for us to be able to open our hearts, to be transparent with our thoughts, our feelings, because it comprises our being. And it's important to be able to articulate that. And just love to read, if I could, just a couple more questions from our viewers that have written into us. Some of the viewers wanted to know a collection of questions. How are our churches actively involved in this situation in terms of making a difference? And another question that was asked, can you please ask how long has strip search been going on in the schools? And what is the government policy around this? So can I just ask maybe Joel to respond to that? How long, in your knowledge, has strip search has been going on in the schools?
This is the first one I've ever heard of or come across in 20 years. That's not to say they don't happen or haven't happened. I would suggest it's quite irregular. And I think one of the breakdowns here was that the school's officer was not present for, I think there was a breakdown for COVID reasons. And I would like to think, please Lord, that had that officer been there, perhaps this would have gone differently, because the level of relationship would have been different. The level of knowledge of the child, of the situation, of the powers that are prevalent in schools, which are maybe sometimes slightly different to outside in a public space where searching and extra searching is involved. But to my knowledge, I don't have the stats available. I'm sorry, but to my knowledge, it's not regular.
Right.
But equally, to my knowledge, it isn't, unless a child is being seen to commit some level of crime, it's not that regular that teachers would leave a child with police officers either. So there's a massive, for me, there's a massive grey area, which I have questions myself, like procedurally, what happened there. But I would suggest it's not regular, sir.
Okay, thank you, Joel. I'd love to invite Sharon, Dr. Sharon, to respond to that point, because in your journey and experience, lived experience of King Solomon International Business School, XL3, Black Boys, etc., could you respond to that? Are you aware of that? But I'd love to add a rider to that. What should have happened? Because for our viewers that are out there, what should have happened in the case of Child Q? Just to have stopped this thing in its track when the police came knocking. From you, what should have happened? Just tell for the benefit of our viewers. Dr. Sharon.
Right, well, this is the first case that I'm aware of. I was having a discussion with our principal only this morning, and in all of the years that she's been in education, she's never heard of anything like that happening either. So it is irregular. It should never have happened. Should never have happened. I think in relation to, I know the school had previously a suspicion that the girl was involved in drugs. They didn't deal with it effectively then. Whenever that happened, they didn't deal with it effectively then. They, from what I can remember, they had a discussion with the parent and raised a concern with the parent, but at no point in time did they actually contact the social services and inform them and sought to get some professional advice. So whatever concern that they had, whether it was genuine or not, they didn't go far enough in addressing it. And had they done that then, that maybe things wouldn't have escalated to where they are today. So that's the first thing that the school should have done. I mean, they acted appropriately in terms of searching the child. That is very appropriate. But they should have taken things forward to have got that professional expertise, and they didn't do that. In this case, again, where they suspected that this little lamb, again, may have been involved in drugs because they could smell something on her. First thing that they should really do is contact the parent. For me, the parent it's absolutely essential. The parent, it's somebody's child, and she is a child. She is underage, so the parent should have been contacted, and nothing further should have taken place. For me, there was no immediate danger to the child, or the child wasn't causing any immediate danger to anybody else. At the end of the day, she was sitting in an exam. She wasn't doing anything apart from sitting an exam. So there was no immediate danger. So for me, I really don't understand. It's inexcusable that the police was even called. It's just inexcusable.
Right. Yes. Thanks, Sharon, for that. Professor Dawn and then Dr. Lurling very quickly, and then Minister Joyce, just to respond to that as to what should have happened. Thank you, Sharon.
Well, from my point of view, what should have happened is the school will definitely have procedures around safeguarding. And in actual fact, it sounds from the reports that some of that happened, and well, not the safeguarding element, but the procedural element, insofar as the teachers asked the child. They then did a regular search, so they searched her clothing and her bag. Nothing was found. Now, we've got a detective inspector here, so he can tell us what should have happened next. But my understanding is they didn't find anything. And we all know that if you walk past people, whether it's cigarettes or weed, and people are smoking, all you have to do is to walk past them, and that smell will cling to your clothes. But it seems as though these teachers had an encounter with this child before. they hadn't been able to find anything, and it looked like they were determined to find something. So they went back, and when they searched it and didn't find anything, they went to the next level. And where this has all gone even more disastrously wrong is that the enforcement of that by the police. But it actually speaks to me of what is happening in that school environment, where teachers' first response is not about the safety, the education, and the welfare of a child, but about bringing in police and actually strong-arming the police into potentially criminalizing this child. That's where I think we're focusing a lot on the police, as I said at the beginning. I think that's quite right, because they perpetrated the action, but actually it's a systemic issue, because those teachers should have been protecting the child. They shouldn't have been calling the police and then standing outside the door while this happened, and then taking her back to the class, wouldn't let her have a drink of water, just didn't treat her like a human being. That's where I think we need to make sure that we don't just focus on the police, but we also need to look at the education system, because they failed as well.
Indeed, I fully agree with Dr. Learning. Thank you.
Absolutely. In relation to this being a systemic problem, clearly it is, because as previous speakers have said, the child protection policy in place in schools throughout the UK states that they're required to have a designated child protection officer who then has supposed, so even if the accusation came from a teacher, then that the child protection officer would be involved. And where is the head teacher in all of that? Where is the senior management of the school who should be aware of all of these things? And if they initially searched and found nothing, then you would imagine that if there is still a concern, to contact the parents and say, we have got this concern, we have no evidence, but this is, so we're bringing this to your attention. But I don't know where it came from to call the police in. And I agree that it's not an initial police problem. The first line of responsibility is really that of the school, from the teacher right through to the head teacher and everything. So it's the school first. But my real cause of concern, in addition, is the fact that when the police were called, that they did not clarify that. Is it that they didn't know? And sometimes people say it needs better training or whatever. I don't think that, you need to be a specialist to understand that you don't come in and take a child and do that without a parent or anybody around and search them in that way. So for me, that is not a training issue. And it does speak, as far as I'm concerned, it speaks to the adultification of children in our school system. It's the kind of thing, why is it that usually the response is usually harsher than that of their white counterparts? And I do feel quite strongly that the focus on child Q must be having such a far-reaching impact on this individual. We haven't yet talked about consequences and so on, because who's paying for all of these psychological input that needs? Who is a family getting psychological help? Every time child Q hears child Q, there's something inside of her that's going to cause a response. It might be that her name is protected at the moment, but the fact is she knows who she is, and there are actually other people who know also. Her family and the impact on her family. In addition to all of that is the fact that all of this was just raised by a counsellor who had the common sense to actually, and the care to actually raise this properly, because here's a child cutting and going through it. But what is the future of this child? So who's paying for those sessions? Is there any compensation, financial compensation to this child for this situation that has happened? What other protective measures are being put in place to support her and her family? There's all of this, I just think an apology is not enough. What are we going to do? Because what we've already discussed and highlighted is the fact that, and even as I said, the Secretary of State for Education himself, Nadine Zahawi, have actually mentioned the far-reaching impact on this child. We're all aware of that, but what is being done to address this? And what is happening? What messages are we communicating then to the staff involved, the staff of the school, and for me, even the GP who didn't raise the concern? Refer them to a counsellor but didn't raise a concern. So it is systemic, clearly. But the fact is, what are we doing to support this family, to support this child who's been demoralized, who's been shamed, I can't imagine and the way in which she was brought back into that examination situation, but also for the last 2 years, they've lived with this. What is the impact that we are actually highlighting in relation to these individuals involved? You know, are these officers, is something going to be done? I understand that through a community event, 2 of the officers have been taken off duty at this point in time. However, what of the teachers? What of the school? What has been said? What has been done for this outrageous breach of child protection? I'm saying, what are the consequences? And where there is no consequence, there is no temperature measure.
Indeed. Thank you. Very, very important points that you've articulated there, Dr. Lurling. I think it's important for us to just to look at those points, note them, and certainly as a part of a network of churches, we have reached out to be able to say, as it were, here's oil, here, wine, we want to pour into the wounds. Through our counseling and support services, we've put them on standby, and we've been reaching across to do that. It's a part of the thought, voice, and action strategy that we have. There are many more things, but yes, indeed, you've raised some important points there around consequences going forward. We've run out of time, so unfortunate. But a part of what our thoughts is, and Reverend Joyce would, we wanted to get the Education Secretary here to have a dialogue with him, because yes, it is systemic, and to hold those that are have heavy responsibility, foremost responsibility in the public square, to have this dialogue, this conversation, not just a one-off, because there are a number of other issues that are coming from this. But Rev Joyce, over to you.
Thank you, Bishop. I just want to, before we close, just a couple of messages to parents or young people that might be watching today. I think hold us to account as well as the church, because we have a right and we must speak up and speak out on behalf of our community and our constituents. And we won't stop here. We've had an invitation. We will make sure that this continue, and we will have a part 2 to this, where we will invite young people and parents. Also, if there's anyone that's listened tonight that's been touched, or it's been a trigger for something that you may have gone through, or something that's happening to you, number 1, we do have a service, Sentient, which is a counselling service. But I would also suggest that you go to your GP and make sure that your voice is heard. You can write to your MP. Your MPs and your local councillors are there to serve you. If you don't know how to do that, reach out to someone within your local constituency. There must be someone that you can speak to, but we can put something on our website, a template that you can write to your MP and make your voice heard. And so there have been recommendations that have come out of this report. There are several recommendations that is about policy change, and we somehow, Bishop, and all of us that are sat here, we need to be engaged with ensuring the follow through of those policies and seeing that those policies are making a difference in terms of outcomes for our young people and children. And it's not just about strip searches, it's about stop and search and many other areas where we see discriminatory practice and disproportionality, where people are being criminalized instead of taking and draconian approaches. Professor Dawn, mental health is a big issue, and she talked earlier on about the trauma that's associated with what people go through in their early years and how that plays out. And we've got the skills amongst us to do some work around mental health, trauma, and informing our leaders how we can be that signpost for supporting. So without any further ado, we want to thank you, Dr. Sharon Byfield, Dr. Lurleen Miller, Detective Inspector Joel Edwards, Professor Dawn Edge, and Commander Alison
Haydari.
Dari for joining us, and everyone that in the background that has worked really hard in putting this together very, very quickly for this platform to be here. All of you that sent questions in, thank you. Keep them coming. And I understand that there's been, we have loads and loads, hundreds of comments that,
hundreds,
that are coming in, and we must take the time to look at those comments and see how we move that forward. That's my closing remark, Bishop. So unless there's anything else you want to say for us to close.
Yes, I would just love to pray and introduce the thought of a prayer of lament. Won't go into all I plan to say because we're over time, but allow me just to pray just a short prayer of lament from Lamentations 3, 21 through 24 from the ESV. It reads, "But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope." And we pray for hope for Child Q's family, and all those that we do not know about, that have not been opened and disclosed to the public. We pray, Lord, that your steadfast love will never cease, will flow and overflow, and may your mercies never come to an end. Father, we believe they are new every morning, and your faithfulness is great. Lord, you are our portion, so testifies our soul, and therefore will we hope in you. Father, let us be covered under the canopy of your grace as we seek justice, peace, and comfort for your people everywhere. In the name of Jesus be praised. Amen. Thank you. And thank you, Pastor Errol, and the team that have worked, and for all that's been done. And Rev Joyce, as I call you, Minister Joyce, thank you for co-hosting and for working so hard to ensure that we're able to put together in a very narrow time frame this very important dialogue this evening. Heaven's blessings be with you and your family.
Thank you, Bishop, and thank you to all who have tuned in tonight. Thank you for tuning in. This program will be available to be watched afterwards and to be shared as well. God bless you. God bless you.
So great are you, Lord. You give life, you are love, you bring light to the darkness, you give hope, you restore every heart that is broken. Great are you, Lord. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise, pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to only. Great are you, Lord. Sing, you give life. You give life. start. You give hope. Oh yes, you do, my God. And that's why I sing. Sing, it's your breath in our lungs. So we pour out our praise. We pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs. Oh yes, it is, my God. Sing, it's your breath in our lungs. So we pour out our praise. We pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs. Oh Jesus, oh Jesus. To you bow, to you bow, yeah, yeah. So great are you, Lord. So great are you, Lord. Great are you, Lord. So worthy, so worthy, so worthy. So holy you are. So we pour out our praise. Oh, and all the earth will shout your praise. Our hearts will cry, these bones will sing. Great are you, Lord. Oh, and all the earth will shout your praise. Our hearts will cry, these bones will sing. Great are you, Lord. Sing all the earth, all the earth. Our hearts will cry. Sing great, great, great are you, Lord. Sing all the earth, all the earth. Our hearts will cry. Sing great, great, great are you, Lord. Oh, all the earth, all So great are you, Lord. He's my healer, my provider. That's why I sing. He's so worthy for the praise and all the glory and the honor. Great are you, Lord. So great are you, mighty you are. That's why we sing, great are you. Done so much for me, my God. That's why I sing, great are you. My comforter in times of sorrow.